beginning. Welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and today we are talking with, and I'm here with Anthony Marquetta, of course, and today we're talking with Breanne Demarco to discuss her ministry, the stuff that she does online, and to just in general see what servants of the Lord are up to in the general sense. Breanne, thank you for joining us. And Anthony, how are you doing today? I always have to ask.
I had an I had an interesting weekend. Maybe I'll bring if I bring it up, I'll bring it up later, so not to derail the stream.
Good.
But I had an interesting weekend. Uh, okay, so I wanted to start the stream. So first off, hi Brian,
Hello.
welcome.
Thank you.
Uh, I'm gonna read out Psalm 1 because I think it's thematic for what we're talking about, and this is the Psalm. In my translation of it, it's the two ways. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So, I bring up that psalm in particular because I found this stream through Pints with Aquinas, right? You did an interview with Matt Fradd, which I found very compelling. And as I watched the interview, the two ways of Psalm 1 popped into my head because my thought as it was going on, it was a really, really good interview. So good job. uh, was that this is a woman who is she's like, in a sense, you're like all of us, right? Everybody has this choice because that's what the psalm says, right? It doesn't say there are many ways, and one of them is good, and one is a little less good, and then one might be. My brother just walked in the room, and I waved him away because we have a guest. Hi. Anyway, one is a little less good. No, you have two ways: the way of the wicked and the way of the law and the way of God, right? And you are here hovering between these two extremes where you're either like, so I was in a nunnery and I loved it and everything was great. And then it's like, anyway, 1 week after I was out of the nunnery, I was passed out on the floor, surrounded by alcohol. And I'm like, wow, okay. Uh, so why don't you give us your thoughts on, like, what do you think of this theme that I have? And I hope you don't find it insulting because, like, I want to be clear that I am very impressed with where you have ended up. This is not meant as, like, oh, she's this unusually wicked person. Quite the contrary.
No, I mean, here's one of the things that's beautiful about recovery, or that's beautiful about when you do come to know the Lord in a new way, or when you repent, like when there's this new life, you can really look back on the old life, and um it's not offensive. It's not like this like dark past that I can never tell anyone and I'm so ashamed of, because like really, like a lot of healing has to happen for you to get to this place of freedom, of restoration, and kind of that building back up. Like, it took a lot of work to build back up after being
Mm-hmm.
so broken. And so I can joke about it. In fact, I think sometimes it's a bit scandalous to people when I make jokes about it or make light of it. Again, not because it was a light matter, but because like I am in this place of freedom now, and so I can look back at it in that way. So I'm not at all offended in any way, especially when people like joke around about it, and I'm the first to do that too. But I think this theme is perfect because it is the story of everyone's life. Psalm 1 is everyone's life. And when someone though has such glaring and such obvious addictions, or such obvious struggles, such obvious hardships, then
Mm-hmm.
we can really see those two paths kind of like drawn out, because it's so obvious, it's in your face. but it is everyone's story, because even if we're not struggling with things like drugs or homelessness, maybe you're not living under a bridge, it's still your story, that like all it takes is just a little bit veering off of one path, and then before you know
Yeah.
it, you're on the other path. And just as that scripture says, like, like that is the path of the wicked, and it only leads to one place. It's You're not going to get anywhere on that path. So it's a beautiful reminder, because I think sometimes the devil uses that as a leverage in people's lives, by convincing us, like, no, 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 like, you're not that bad, like, you're not shooting up heroin, so you're not that bad, like, your life is fine.
Yeah.
And then we end up in this place of like, okay, well, we're still sinning, or we're still doing these things, we're like actually on the path of wickedness, but because we're not as bad as some others, or people who have very obvious struggles, we can be dismissive about it and go down the path of wickedness even further, or for a longer time, because we don't see it as that. We see it as like, oh, well, I'm not that bad. Like, I'm doing okay. I have a good job. I have a roof over my head. So I think it's a very important topic that applies to everyone.
Yeah, and that's a really good reminder. You're totally right, because there's something in your story. Like, this is with all redemption stories. Redemption stories are a great thing for everyone, because everyone is going to resonate in some way, I think, right? Like, with all, all types of them in all media, right? You're never going to have someone who goes like, no, I don't get it, right? Like, I don't understand, because everybody has made a mistake, regrets it, knows, right? Like, no, there's nobody, all of us have sinned, right? uh so listening to like what you just said now, like, there was a time period where I look back on, and I consider myself to have been like deeply, deeply in like a really bad place. Maybe to say like I would say, yeah, I would say I was like deeply sinning. I don't want to say that I was a sinner, because I am a sinner, because we all still are sinners, right? uh but like, it was also just a really bad place in my life, and at the time, if you had asked me that, I would have told you that I was fine, and I would have meant it, right? And then only now, looking back years later, I go like, no, that was like, yeah, I was in a really bad place. Was away from church for 6 years, right? Wasn't going to mass, all sorts of, right, like, was not involved with anything. I couldn't really look people in the eye, was a big thing, like all sorts of issues like that, right?
Mhm.
And now I'm doing much better, thank God, but it's the same thing. It's like, is what happened with me anywhere near as dramatic as what happened with you? Well, no, because your story is very dramatic. But it doesn't really matter, right? Like, you're not being judged on drama points here. It's not like, okay, well, you repented, and your story was really cool, so
Yeah,
you get a
Hollywood
higher.
convinces us of that, I think, and maybe it's our own ego even, but like sin is sin. So if we had spiritual glasses we could put on for a second, looking at your life and looking at mine, we would see the same level of darkness, the same level of like distance away from God, God
Hmm.
the Father, like it, and so we would see that with those spiritual lenses. But because we live in a secular world that like compares a lot, oh, he's better than her, he's got more money than she does, like we're used to that. And so we'll look and we'll oftentimes put on a scale the sins of people and say, well, okay, this is, like this drug is worse than that drug, or doing this thing is worse than that. And while to a degree there's slight truth to that, it's not important when it comes to
Yeah.
repentance and coming to know your own poverty and how much you need the Lord and that sort of thing. And in that sense, like sin is sin is sin is sin. Like there's no real difference in that. And so yeah, like that's an
Yeah, I think that's the secret too, where you see like all. I mean, there's the verse from Isaiah, "All sin is like dirty rags," which is like one
Mhm.
of the famous Protestant proof texts, right, Ben? Hmm.
Huh? Don't you mean all our
The
works are
Isaiah,
like dirty rags?
yeah, it's one of the big Protestant talking point texts that you bring up. Which, but I
Mm.
think, like, obviously it's in the Bible, so of course there is uh, real truth to it. And I think that's kind of the point, right? Like, this idea of let's sit down and judge who did worse and who did better is missing the point entirely,
Mhm.
right? It's like, no, that's Jesus's whole mission. Like, get the beam out of your own eye. So we've been talking around, like, and kind of implying like that you've been through this journey, but not everybody watched the first interview. So, uh, why don't you give us? I want to think about a put it that one that isn't so vague that you have absolutely no guidance, right? Which is not really fair. So, why don't you tell us like how this whole journey of like addiction to recovery started? Give us the start, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, well, it's so hard to sum it up. I
Mhm.
would really have. You saw my other interview; it was easily 3 hours, and we
Mhm.
didn't even talk about everything. But if I had to kind of give a nice rounded summary, it's that I had a relatively normal childhood. I had great parents. I had all my needs met. I made good grades and that sort of thing. And so I think I always have to start with that because most people, a lot of people, I think, struggle with certain things later in life. And they're like, well, what happened? I had a normal childhood. Because again, we're all used to the stories, like these horror stories of like this kid who was really abused and then they became a drug addict. And so like we can
I
connect with
grasp
things.
that pressure totally because
Right.
this was the thing that happened with me where I had to like sit down and look myself in the eye and go like it's not my parents, it's not my family, it's
Yeah.
me. I
Yeah.
messed up. Yeah. But
Right.
sorry, keep going.
So no, though that's an important part, and people I think need to hear that like you can have a normal childhood and still end up in crazy places or with struggles that maybe you don't understand where they stem from. So I always like to kind of start with that, like things were great. Now, obviously, when I look back, like, okay, maybe I can find some times where like maybe my emotional needs weren't met. Okay, so I had food and clothing and shelter and all that, but like maybe I didn't have someone to talk to when I needed someone to talk to. And so I can look back and kind of see these moments where there were little struggles, but for the most part, it really was like my parents loved each other. I was in a great home and I grew up like that. But by about by about like 12 or 13, I started to notice that well, a little bit before that, at about 10 years old, we moved to a new city. And I felt like I was really struggling to adjust to that move and then to make new friends. And I just wanted people to like me. And it was right at about the time you're going into middle school. So it's like your body starts doing crazy things and your brain is doing crazy things. Like there's so much going on. And on top of that, I'm like, I
Mhm.
feel like I don't fit in. So all of that I think was kind of a perfect storm to get me on this in this place of like not feeling accepted, not feeling loved, not feeling good enough and that sort of thing. And I think that started me on this path of searching like, okay, well if I don't feel confident, there must be something out there that can make me feel confident. Or if I don't feel loved, there must be something out there that can make me feel loved.
Mhm.
And for a young adolescent child, uh like for me it was just turning to the next thing that kind of presented itself. And so I think it started with like self-harming behaviors like in middle school. And then by the time uh also in middle school, like I was introduced to pornography, and so that started. And then by the time I got to like high school, early high school, like 14, 15, then it was, the alcohol, then it was the drugs, then it was whatever I could get my hands on. Like sometimes I wouldn't even know what drugs I was taking. I was just taking it because like I would take anything to just not feel the pain. And the
Mhm.
more it was like trying to grasp sand. It was like the more I tried to like hold on to it, the more it just like things would slip away. And so the more I was like, oh, maybe this thing will bring me happiness or fulfillment or you know um satisfaction, the more like the worse things got. And obviously I was grasping at the wrong things. But it's important to note too that at the same time that I was doing all this, I was still heavily involved at my church. I was still heavily involved at youth group. I was going to the retreats. I was going to the praise and worship. I was reading scripture. I was doing now. I don't think my prayer life in my relationship with the Lord was like authentic or like robust in a way. It was like I would go on these things and have these encounters and feel the love of God and know that he like feel his presence and that sort of thing. But it was falling on rocky soil and it wasn't really taking root in any meaningful way. And so then I was in a way, it was just like all the drugs and alcohol. It was like I would just wait for the next retreat and kind of chase that next high, even though it was a spiritual high. And okay, it was good, it wasn't drugs. It was like I was still like just going from one thing to the other to try to feel better about things. And it all kind of culminates, at least for the high school portion of it, and like at 18,
Mhm.
uh, I ended up in rehab. I had had a drug overdose at about 16, and then it was like I was trying to like get my life together. My parents could tell that like from 16 to 18, from the overdose to rehab, it was like not a lot of progress was being made, and if anything, things got worse. And I think when they saw that, they realized, okay, this is beyond just like, hey, don't do these behaviors. It's like they realized I couldn't stop. I couldn't not do these things. Um, so I went to rehab, came out of that, was like, all right, like I did it. Like now I'm gonna be cured, because I saw all these like professionals, and I did this intense rehab for like 40 days, and we paid like 40 grand. Like this, this was the solution. And then when I relapsed after that, I mean, it was just like it was heartbreaking, because then it was like a gut punch, because it was like, man, if the leading doctors of the country, if the group therapy, if the, throwing all this money at this problem didn't fix it, like what is going to fix it? And obviously I'd prayed for God to take these things from me, for me to not have the desire to do these things or to not be addicted. And like I'd prayed many, many times. So it's like, it really was a dark place of despair suddenly, because okay, well, God's not answering my prayer, and the psychologists, couldn't save me, and my parents couldn't save me, and I can't save me. And so it was a dark place. And I spent the next several years like really just trying to figure it out. But then I end up getting called into mission work, and so I leave and I go do that for a few years. And that, I think, was a time of, there was a certain grace there. I didn't have access to a lot of things. I didn't have access to pornography. I didn't have access to drugs. And so there was a grace there that kind of kept me, I guess you could say, like on the right track. But because I hadn't actually resolved the addiction, because I hadn't actually like healed in any meaningful way, as soon as I got out of doing mission work, like I went right back to everything. And at this point, I was over 21, and so the alcohol really ramped up. And when I came back, I also um, I had lost some weight when I was in mission. So I come back, and then I have this eating disorder that starts up too out of nowhere. And that goes on for years and years. And now there's like even more going on. So now I have like full blown alcoholism. Now I have this eating disorder going on. I'm still watching pornography, like just
Mhm.
insanity. And so I would say like it kind of escalates to the point of a suicide attempt. And the suicide attempt was not because I hated my life per se. Again, I was still involved in ministry, and so I was getting these glimpses and these glimmers of like of hope, of the Lord, of love, of all these like things that were kind of edifying and building me back up. So I wasn't, it's not that I hated my life, but there was also this hopelessness too at the same time, because it seemed like it was even worse, because I was still pursuing the Lord while all these terrible things, like I was still doing these things. It
Yeah.
seemed worse because in my mind it felt like living a double life, like I was being deceptive to people and that sort of thing. And obviously now looking back, I can see like no, no, no. Like if I had not turned back to the Lord that many times, I mean, I would have ended up dead, for sure. If I had given up on God during my addiction and just been like, well, I'll go back to church once I have my
Yeah.
life together. I don't know that I ever would have. I don't know that I would
This
have
was
been.
one aspect of your story that I think is so, so important, that you were doing all like you're kind of the prototypical believer who's like, I don't understand why God is not listening. Aren't I doing all of these things? And
Mhm,
at the same time, you say that, and
mhm,
then there's the voice in the back of your head going, well, I know why he's not listening, because I'm horrible, right? Like, why would he listen? Like, but
yeah,
you're also upset because isn't he supposed to help? But
right.
then when you feel guilty about it, it becomes this feedback loop. And you could see that as I'm saying this, like clearly I understand exactly where all of this mindset comes from. It makes me think of John Newton, who is the writer of Amazing Grace. If you actually look at his story and how he wrote it, it's like famously he was a slave trader and he eventually became a pastor, and he wrote a very famous essay near the end of his life where he against slave trading, and he like admits he was a slave trader and says, "I'm embarrassed and ashamed," you know. But if you actually read his life, it's like the series of he converts. You know, he's going to die. He's on a storm in the sea. He begs God to save him, and God saves him, and he converts. And then he forgets, and he goes back to being a slave trader. And then something else happens. And like this happens like 3 or 4 times. Like even when he gets married to his wife, like the people who his wife's parents didn't want her to marry him. They're like, you can't marry this guy. He's unstable. Like, you know, he writes raunchy hymns, which was also a thing, by the way. Like he wrote raunchy lyrics, and they're like, you
No,
can't, you
well,
know, you can't.
what he did was he took raunchy bar songs and turned them into hymns.
Oh, was okay. I got it
So
backwards.
to
I'm
be
sorry.
very clear, he's not like lyricizing the Song of Solomon or something. It's like I don't think Amazing Grace was particularly a bar song, but I know quite a few of the other ones were, which
No, Amazing Grace was in a hymnal that he put out, so he was like actually composing them, and then I do think that the tune to it was a bar song that was attached later, which happens all the time. That
yeah.
happened with the national anthem, but yeah, like, but the point being that he, you know, you see in his life as well, like this idea that conversion is a thing that happens once, and
Mhm.
now you're there, is not actually true in life, right? Like it's never true. It's always a process. It's not going to happen overnight, you know. Uh it certainly didn't with me. Like there was a point, like in between the point where I look back and I consider that I'm like, okay, this is my rock bottom, right? And the point where I would say I started making serious progress was a years long gap in between those two states. So it's like, well, what was I doing in those years when I knew the problem, even kind of knew the solution to it, but I wasn't doing it, you know? So yeah, I think that that's one of the things in your story that's really really compelling. It also makes me think of Augustine's Confessions, if you've ever seen, you
Mhm.
know, in Augustine's Confessions. That's another thing. This was a Augustine probably beats all of us because his was a decades long process, right? Of his mother literally following him around and like begging him to convert, you know, and to put aside his hedonism, right? And eventually he becomes Saint Augustine, you know, and he becomes like the great Bishop of Hippo. But he's like in his early life, you know, he was like about as bad as you could be, right? Like he was this hedonistic he was this hedonistic womanizer. He was also flirting with weird heresies at various times just because he thought he thought they sounded cool, you know, and that it would be edgy if he did it. Like
Mhm.
not that he would put it in that language because he's from the early Middle Ages, but
Stealing
you know,
pears was so edgy.
yeah, it's that's kind of the vibe you get. You know, the famous
Yeah.
passage where he's like, "But why did I steal the pear?" You
Yeah.
know, and he's like, "But why?"
So
And
that's like the story. Like, I mean, in a way, it's kind of like welcome to the human race. Like that is that is everyone's story. I mean, Paul talks about like why do I don't do the things that I know I should do. I do the things that I hate. Like what's going on with me? Like why am I like this? And in a way, I'm grateful for that because that means that every day I have to recognize I'm in need of a savior. If it was a one and done moment, why would I need God? Like, why would I need to have a relationship with the Father if it's like, cool, you saved me, you took away all my addictions, all my vices. Like, I no longer struggle with pride or lying or comparison or judgment. Like, cool, I'll just be on my merry way. But the fact that like every day I mess up to in some way, like, but because it's happening every day, it's like, man, like no, I need God just as much today as I did back when I was like in full-blown addiction. And I think if I don't acknowledge that, I can get cocky and I can get prideful and I can think like, no, 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 I got it. Like I know what's best. And it keeps us in a sense, it keeps us on the march to Cal. Like it's the way of the cross, right? Like
Mhm.
we are on that for this entire lifetime. Now, does anyone want to be on that path? No, because we want, like, I want God to answer all my prayers and for everything to be like smooth sailing and for life to be good.
Mhm.
And that's what we desire, I think, which is why people love, they love to think that like conversion happens in an instant and then you're healed and you never struggle again and blah blah blah. But it's like, no, every day the Lord has to like convert my heart. He has to break away the hardness
Mhm.
that's forming around it, and save me in the daily. And that's what keeps me on that path, though, because every day I have to pick up my cross, and every day it's going to look different, and there will be suffering and there will be struggles. But like, I'm not marching that alone. Like, the Lord is there with me. We're carrying this cross together, we're being crucified together. And through that, like, it's through that path that then is like, that's where the salvation comes from. Like, that's where that leads. And so, um yeah, it's definitely a hard message for people to hear. But yeah, like, I mean, after my suicide attempt, it was like the Lord uh, came and visited me in a very like real way, and I felt that, and I knew that, and I knew that was God, like, literally coming down to save me.
Yeah,
And
I want to mention that because I recall that story, and the story is a really interesting. So, to be clear for listeners too, like this was an actual vision of God, correct?
well, here's the thing, because I think Matt kind of asked me that question, and I'm like, yeah, like I saw the Lord. So I had overdose. I had intentionally overdosed as a way of attempting suicide. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, I black out at a certain part at a certain time on a certain day. And I do not have any memories at all for about 3 days, almost 4. Okay. So, there is only one thing that I can remember from those 3 or 4 days, and it was, and I'll share the story. But so when I say I saw it with my eyes, like I did, it's the only thing I can remember. But like, I was also in a weird state, like, I mean,
Yeah,
like, I
like who's to
died.
say how literal it was,
Right,
but
right, right, right. And so
as
I guess
far as you know.
that's what I'm trying to get at, is like,
Mhm.
yeah, did I see him with my own eyes? Yeah, but also maybe not, because I was also in a hospital in a, I don't know if it was
Mhm.
a coma or whatever, like they induce you in so they can like pump your stomach and all that. But anyway, so I had taken medication again. At this point, it's like I couldn't understand how my life, I didn't hate my life, but I couldn't understand how I could continue with it being as insane as it was. It was like I would, you know, get caught in these cycles of like drinking till I blacked out. And then when I would come to, it was like, oh, I feel bad for drinking. So I'm going to like binge and purge on food. And then I would do that and I'd feel bad and disgusting from that. So then I would watch pornography to feel not bad and disgusting. And that would make me feel even more bad and disgusting. And it was like just this constant like loop. And that was happening like every day for hours. Like the whole day, it was just like bouncing back and forth from one addiction to the next. And I just remember being like, this is crazy, and I just want it to stop. And I didn't want my life to end, but I wanted that particular insanity that was going on, I wanted that to stop. And because I didn't know what the solution was, it just seemed like if I could just not be alive, then that would stop and I would finally be able to rest and have some relief. um so anyways, so I take a bunch of medication, and I end up in a hospital, and I'm trying everything I can to make sure that they can't save me. Like, I'm telling them they can't contact my parents or the lady I was living with. Like, I didn't want them to know who I was or if I had any allergies or medical history. Like, I did not want them saving me. But then they take me to this room, and they give me one of those big cups that has like a charcoal like liquid drink,
Yeah.
and they tell me to drink it, and the nurse walks out. She didn't stand there to make sure I drank it, so of course I don't even take a sip. I get up and I dump the whole thing in the trash can. And that was the last thing I remember, like the thud of that cup hitting that metal trash can floor. And like, at that point, I black out. I have no memories. I don't know how long I was in that room. I don't know if I passed out, who found me, whatever. So um at some point, and again, I don't know the details, but I guess at some point they realized this, and I'm sure they had to revive me, and my body was shutting down because I took so much medication. Um, and I don't know at what point, but at some point, the lady I was living with got contacted somehow, and um, I think I don't know all the details, but I think one of her neighbors commented like, is everything okay? We saw the like ambulance at your house, and the ambulance was there to pick up me, but she was away, so she didn't know anything. And so I think that's kind of how she found out, was through a neighbor. Anyways, so she, being the um, just beautiful, holy woman that she was, calls a priest right away and gets a priest to go up there to visit me. And so here's the only memory I have. And I at one point I remember opening my eyes and seeing a priest sitting at the foot of my bed, and he was a Dominican priest serving there at, it was a small parish, like a parish mission sort of thing. And he's in the all white, old man, and he's sitting at the foot of my bed. He's just sitting there, kind of looking at me and smiling, and I can't talk, I can't say anything to him, like I can't move. I close my eyes. And then when I open my eyes again, this time it's now Christ sitting at the foot of my bed, where the priest was sitting. And it was, I remember just like this, like again, I couldn't talk, I couldn't move, but I just felt like hot with like embarrassment and like shame and like almost kind of like anger, like don't look at me, like go away, like right now this is like the worst I've ever looked in my entire life. Like, why are you here, Jesus? Because again, I loved the Lord, and there was a part of me that
Yeah,
like, it felt like I was
I
disappointing
think
him.
there is a sense, and I'm getting this, I'll mention why in a moment, where that reaction is, I don't know if I would say it's appropriate exactly, but it's a precursor to like people who are on the right track. If your
Mhm.
reaction is indifferent, it's much more wrong, right?
Right.
And I'm
Yeah.
thinking the reason I think of this, I think of it's one of my favorite passages in the Bible because it's such a human moment, is when Christ does the miracle in front of Peter. He brings the fish in, and you get these moments in the Gospels, which are my favorite parts of the Gospels, that I'm sure there's probably a scholarly term, but I've always called them breakthrough moments,
Mhm.
where the apostles, who collectively have like one brain cell in the Gospels, have these kind of moments where they all look at each other and then they go like, is this bigger than we thought it was, right? Like, and this is one of those moments where Peter's talking to this guy who Andrew has told him, right? He's like, oh, this is the son, the Lamb of God, right? And Andrew's told him, but Peter, like, he goes, whatever. And they have the catch of fish, and then Peter sees this and realizes, oh crap, Andrew was right all along. And he drops to his knees and says, depart from me, for I am a sinful man. And I think that's not the correct reaction, right? Like, but it's close. It's a lot closer to the
Mhm.
correct reaction than someone who either spits on him or somebody who isn't impressed at all, right? Like you, because Peter has a recognition of the gulf between the two. You at least, you shouldn't be telling Christ to leave in the moment, but you've recognized the gulf
Right.
between. Yeah.
Yeah, because I understood like I was embarrassed because I'm like, okay, I just tried to take the th- the most precious gift that I could be given from the Lord, which is my life, right? Like life itself, like, and I just tried to take that. And now here he is, and he's being present to me. And part of why it was so overwhelming was because he wasn't scolding me. He wasn't looking, shaking his head or waving a finger. He was just staring at me, smiling. And in a way that made it like more, like I panicked even more because it's like, wait, like you should be pissed. You should be punishing me. You should be, tell me how awful I am. And he was doing none of that. He was just like loving on me in that moment with his smile of
Yeah.
his
And
eyes.
again, you go back to Christ's reaction to Peter. He doesn't rebuke Peter for this,
Mhm.
or not direct. He tells him, like, hey, you know what you're doing now? Like, I have something better. You
Mhm.
know. I can bring you, right? Like what
Exactly.
you're doing now, you're a fisherman. That's not, I can make you a fisher of men. Yeah, which is a very mysterious line when you think about it, right? Like now we're so used to it, but to Peter that had to be like, what do you mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's the same, right? It's the same kind of idea of Christ's reaction to this recognition. There's it's the reaction to like a genuine type of repentance too, right? Like he's not going to throw people away who are genuine, who are sitting there ashamed of themselves because they've sinned, because that kind of defeats the whole purpose of why he's here and what he's doing, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's so we're on this part of the story, and this is like the downswing, and this is probably the closest. I don't know if I would say it's a rock bottom because it goes in waves, right? In the way you tell it, but this is probably the closest to a rock bottom, I would say, that if you're going to pick a point.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was a big reality check. It's hard to always pinpoint a rock bottom because there were so many times where I was like, no, this is my rock bottom. And it was
Yeah.
like every time it got like there was a worse rock bottom. So it really is hard to be like, no, that was the one for sure. And I think it's good in a way for us to hit multiple rock bottoms because it really does show us like how much we need the Lord and we need his grace and we need him to save us. And so you know this was a big moment for me. And so after I see Jesus sitting there for my bed, I close my eyes and I don't have any other memories until I was in Louisiana. I guess at some point I get discharged from the hospital. Again, don't have any memory of this. We end up back in Austin where I'm from. And so they released me to like an outpatient rehab. And my next memory is like days later in that outpatient rehab. And so it really was a profound experience. And when I share it, like people are like, oh, okay, so that was the moment, like the Lord saved you and then you never struggled again, you never sinned again. But that's the reality of addiction, but just of being a sinner is that like no, like I did sin again. I sinned plenty again. And in fact, like there were many, I would say there were several rock bottoms, maybe even after that still. And but it was certainly a pivotal point. It was kind of like I said, a good reality check of like, okay, now the Lord has saved me. Now the Lord has made it very clear that like he's not giving up on me. He hasn't. And although I have tried to give up, he has not. And I needed that boost because I would continue to fight. I would have to continue to try to figure out how to overcome these things for a few years, even after that.
I want to talk a little bit about like eventually we're getting there because we're going through the story, but this isn't Matt's interview, so I can go in any order.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Unless Ben stops me since he's actually in charge. But anyway. Anyway, so what I was thinking of, like, you kind of put a lot of your, I wouldn't say all of it, but you put a lot of your recovery on Alcoholics Anonymous and the various of those types of groups, right? Like alcoholics and and sex addiction and things like that, right? The anonymous groups. One thing that struck me and that you indicated, I don't know a whole lot about them, right? Like I know the basics of them, like I know what they are through pop culture osmosis, basically. I would say that I was roughly on the right track, but not, I never researched it before, especially before I watched you. I really didn't research it, but like it struck me the way that you were talking about it is that a lot of the advice that they were giving and that you were giving and talking about, like, this is what they say to do. It's like, well, that's just how you overcome sin. Like, that's not really right. Like, yeah, like, for example, you go like, oh, if you have any temptation, don't go anywhere near it. And then Matt was agreeing and talking about pornography in his case. And you're like, yeah. And I go, well, isn't that just what Jesus says in the gospel? Right? Like, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Right? Like, this is literally, that's the whole point. Right?
So it's
like,
I'll give you a little. What's interesting about Alcoholics Anonymous, because again, most people don't know much about the program because about the 12 steps, because well, it's an anonymous group, and unless you're going to meetings, you're really not going to know what's going on or how it works and that sort of thing. But it was Alcoholics Anonymous was born about 100 years ago, okay, early 1900s. And it was heavily influenced by a Jesuit priest, and there was also a Catholic nun who influenced it. And so, a lot of times when you go and you read the actual literature, they have this thing called the Big Book, which is kind of like what outlines how the program works, how the steps work, what you need to do to stay sober, basically. And when you read it, like you start to like read it, and you're like, "What? Like this is like pretty like almost Catholic." Um, Certainly, it's very, very
Really.
Christian based, even
Yeah.
not just specifically Catholic. But you'll find in there like meetings start with like the Our Father, right? The Lord's Prayer. A lot of times, there's the Serenity Prayer. They have that. The Saint Francis Prayer is another big one that they say in the program. Okay, so and this is a secular group.
Hmm.
So the program gets started because they at the time were trying to treat alcoholism with all sorts of different things like electrocution, like they were trying to, they were locking people up and like, basically letting them die because they didn't know that they were going through these withdrawals and stuff like that. But they were trying to figure out like how we can make people stop, and they couldn't, and they kept failing. And no matter what you did, these alcoholics were ending up back in these insane asylums, and no one wanted to take them either because they were um because again, people didn't understand it. And so there was a hospital where this nun was working, and she was willing to like help these alcoholics. And even, interestingly enough, they give out these little chips in the program that like when you hit like 30 days sober, you get a chip. When you hit 2 months, you get another chip. They're these little coins, these little medallions.
Hmm.
So milestones of sobriety. But even that originated from this little Catholic nun who would give people a miraculous medal, and she would tell them to hold on to it. And if they wanted to drink again when they got out of the hospital, they would need to come and give her the medal back. And then she, she's like, then you can go out and drink again or whatever. But there was this, she's trying to like hold them accountable basically. But there's a lot of things in it that you could tell came from a hugely, basically they had to realize that no amount of psychotherapy was working, no amount of like even like physical, like, oh, let's have them detox in this way and let's give
Hmm.
them this drug and let's do this with their bodies. That wasn't enough to get an alcoholic to stop. Consequences were not enough to get an alcoholic to stop. Okay, so people were losing jobs and loved ones and losing careers or like any sort of prospects. That wasn't enough to get people to stop. And what they realized in the beginning was the only time they ever saw alcoholics recover was when two things happened. Okay. The first was that they had a profound spiritual experience, is what they kind of worded as. And the second was that they then took that experience and tried to help other alcoholics to stay sober. Okay, so it was this experience
Yeah.
and then carrying that same message, that hope, that experience
Yeah,
to
because
others.
from what I've seen with people who criticize, and I use it with quotation marks, Alcoholics Anonymous, I've generally seen two arguments made. One is people going like they claim they're not religious, but we all know they are, which is kind of true. Right? Like, but that's not really a reason, is it? That's just people who are unhappy that this is actually what works, right? The other thing that I have seen people genuinely point to is that, well, statistically it just doesn't really work at a higher, like we've run the numbers, but I don't know, I've never been convinced by this for a couple of reasons as I've thought it over. First is that's an anonymous group, so how are you getting accurate
Right.
numbers anyway? Like it would be really, really hard to find accurate numbers. And second is, well, what are you considering success? It's like, are you comparing it to other things? Like, well, the truth is that this is just a very difficult thing for anyone to overcome. It reminds me of, this is a weird comparison, I know, but bear with me. Like, it reminds me of people who go like on Kitchen Nightmares with Gordon Ramsay, and they go, only 20% of the restaurants survive. And it's like, great, but that's 20% of 100% failing restaurants,
Mhm.
right? That we're going to fall over. So, like, is this a good or a bad number? Well, truthfully, you need more context either way, because how much of this has anything to do with what he actually did? It's the same with Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Like, how much of the success is due to the group versus otherwise? Well, obviously, study is needed, but study's impossible because they're anonymous.
Right. And
So,
that's the thing is, I, from my personal experience of being in and out of the 12-step program since I was 18. So gosh, I don't know, 15 plus years at this point. Okay. Um, but my my own experiences, I have never seen anyone recover and stay recovered for like an extended period of time without acknowledging a higher power. And that's the term they use. So people who have beef with, AA because it's a religious group, it's
Yeah.
not, because they'll tell you when you get there that you don't have to know who or what God is. You just have to know that it's not you, that you, the alcoholic, are not going to be able to save
Mhm.
yourself. You're not going to be able to stop yourself from drinking, because if you could have, you would have by now. So it's silly to even think that you can save yourself. So what you have to do when you get to AA is not necessarily become a believer in God as most people understand him, or in even the Christian sense of God. You just have to acknowledge that, like, okay, it's not you. And it can be anyone. You can choose anyone or anything as your higher power. It could be like even just going to meetings for a while, like that's your higher powers, the group or whatever, until you have that profound experience, that profound religious experience that
Yep.
they kind of talk about, that spiritual experience. Like, it's okay. You don't have to know right away. And so that should never be a stopping thing. And then to your other point, like, yeah, like I have never seen anyone who has obtained lasting sobriety that is thriving in their sobriety, who did it without God, without that
Right.
aspect. Now, I
And that
have
is
some
the one
people who
thing
like,
that is
go ahead.
it's always acknowledged. I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off. I'm
No.
waiting for you to stop and then it's going. But it is the one thing, and you mentioned this earlier, like that is actually in all of the literature because like, and it's always begrudgingly in the literature because everybody hates that it's there because it's not comfortable for people. But if you break an addiction, it's like the one consistent factor, overwhelmingly, always, no matter what, is like a conversion experience
Right.
in some way. It's like overwhelmingly this will do it, and there is no other consistent factor,
Yeah.
but this is a consistent factor, and they hate it, and they're like, but you got to admit, like this is what we're seeing,
Yeah, because there's a difference between, okay, sometimes I will meet people who say, well, I had a drug problem back in the day when I was younger, and and I was able to stop on my own. And okay, so a couple of things is one, perhaps they were not a full-blown addict when we think of the term addict. There are some people who can mess with a substance and then just kind of like leave it, versus someone who will literally mess with a substance until it kills them. Like, even if the
Yeah.
prospect of it killing them is not enough to get them to stop, that's how uncontrollable they are with that substance. It could be the same substance, pick the same drug, pick the same whatever. Like, why is it that some people can take it and then leave it and then other people can't, right? But the other thing is, so when people tell me like, oh well, I was able to stop on my own, so like, okay, maybe they weren't really a true addict in the sense. Maybe they just like were going through a dark time in their life and it was like a little crutch for a time. But then, are they living a life where they are thriving, where they are vibrant, where they have come fully alive? And that I often don't see in those supposedly like self-recovered addicts who like recovered themselves without
Yeah.
God. Um, we call it in the program, we call it being a dry drunk. And what it means is, okay, you're not drinking, but you're miserable. You're angry. You're cutting people off on the road. You're lashing out at the cashier. Maybe your
Mhm.
marriage is like just an absolute mess. You're still struggling with your ego and your pride. Like, all of those aspects, we would say in the program, like, that is not someone who is working a program. And that's kind of how I see it. And so, yeah, okay, they're not drinking, but they're not really sober either, because they are still very much
Yeah,
living a self centered life.
it's interesting too because when I think of God and religion, like probably the most common addiction today, I would say in the modern world is pornography, right?
Yes.
And for a variety of reasons, uh, I would say I can't really speak to how many women, and I haven't looked up the statistics on it. I would say most young men have been exposed to pornography, and probably I would guess over half of young women, though exactly how many I couldn't say. Right, but I could speak fairly confidently that like most young men have been exposed and probably have regularly watched it at least at some point. Right.
Hmm.
What's interesting to me is that I think of like the guy we talk about in the show most often is an author. His name is John C. Wright, and he was a Catholic convert who from atheism, who saw all of these things. He's really really interesting guy. Like he had what caused him to convert was a variety of things, but he had visions, right? Like really interesting. One of them, though, he thought of himself, as he said, as a very logical thinker, and he independently came to the conclusion that contraception must be immoral. Now,
Mm.
I've never met anybody but him who has ever independently come to that conclusion. I think he's right,
Mhm.
right? Like, I think he's completely correct, but never have I met anyone. And he's saying, well, and at the time he said this really bothered him because he's like, how are my hated enemies, the Christians, and specifically the Catholics, the only ones who are right about this, right? Like, that
Mhm.
doesn't make any sense, because I would bring it up to other people and explain the argument, and they just like would they would agree with every premise and then say, yeah, but your conclusion is wrong because I don't like it,
Yeah.
uh right, something like that. And it makes me think of this with like pornography too, where I go like, okay, so if can I tell you intellectually why pornography is wrong? 100%. I could probably do it pretty easily, actually. Like, the way it abuses people, all of this stuff. If I were not a Christian, would any of these arguments actually make an impact on me?
Mhm.
It is very hard for me to say 100%. Oh yeah, no, it absolutely would, right? Like, I'm not sure I could honestly say that because there's a different, even though this is where it's like, you get the atheists go like, well, if you need God to motivate you, you're a monster. Well, that's great, but everybody, and in a sense, he's right. Like, we're all sinners here, right? It's like, you're kind of correct, right? Uh, and this is where, like, pornography, I think, is a good example because it's one where it's like, I think you could honestly get the average teenager to even grasp why it's wrong, right? Like, it's not even really that hard. A lot of the issues with it are obvious. It's like, come on, like, who are you kidding here? You could see how
Mhm.
exploitative it is. It's really, really, like, you could see how addictive it is.
Well,
The evidence, you know, go
there,
ahead, Ben.
well, there's things that kind of get into the way of it. Like for me, it's like like the argument it's exploitative does nothing. It doesn't even ripple over my brain that it's exploitative. Of course, it's exploitative. And some of these people make some very bad decisions on mostly faulty information, but not always faulty information. To actively participate in it. In the end, most
Yeah,
of these poor people had a contract shoved in their face and they signed. It's like if you were reading a pulp novel and some dude made a pact with a voodoo priest. Won't you shake this poor sinner's hand? In the end, the voodoo priest cannot point a gun at you and say shake my hand. They for the porn performers. Yeah, some of them have in the darker places, but it's like especially for what we would call the mainstream stuff, I guess. Unfortunately, you can't really say that about them. These are people with careers and awards and all this jazz. It can't blip. For other things with like alcoholics, um, my dad was an alcoholic. He had a similar structure for you, Breanne, where he was dying on a hospital bed of alcoholism. Essentially, his kidneys were shutting down. His body was not calming down at all. His heart was racing itself to death. And the doctor's like, "We got nothing for you. Sorry." And then left him. And then he saw the 700 Club on, and back when they preached the gospel and went
wow, what a
weird.
throwback.
I know. Uh, uh, what am I thinking? Right. And then when it came on, he gave his life to Jesus, and immediately his heart stopped beating as hard. He lost all desire for alcohol. He was no longer able, driven by this demand, to consume alcoholic beverages. There has to be, I'm agreeing with sort of the
The larger
alcohol,
point.
the larger point. There has to be something that says, this is wrong and you can't do it. That isn't some sort of logical argument. In the end, people really aren't convinced by logical arguments as
Hmm.
much as they say they are. If like I'm sure when I talk to John, who is a Catholic as we've mentioned, and I'm a Protestant, and he says, well, what about the church fathers? You can't read the church fathers and still be Protestant. And I'm like, I read the church fathers. Like I'm pretty sure Origin would agree with me on some of this stuff, but or some other smart remark that should get me a slap in the mouth or something. But it's the logic, is great. For people who logic really vibes with, it can work. But in the end, it's still sin and it's still a spiritual problem. For the really big, performers who get these big paychecks, I'm pretty sure that whatever is going on in their soul, they can comfort themselves on their pleasures and comforts, their alcoholism or whatever, keeps them, from the noose. But for some, it's just not enough. For others, maybe they do it once and then leave it, but it's hard to make an argument of the value of a human being when, especially for like the mainstream stuff, it was a willing handshake. Even for those who were tricked into a quote unquote modeling gig, I have no clue what they were thinking. Like I wish I could be sympathetic for it, but and maybe I'm just a very suspicious person. I'm not gonna claim I'm smarter than them in every regard or anything like that. But like, why didn't anyone go? This is not a modeling gig. This was never a modeling gig, and
I
it
get
was
your point.
like
Yeah,
there's the I'm trying to sort of push away from the logical and say that in the end, you know, I saw pornography when I was in middle school, and it was mostly like cheerleaders on the backs of magazines and in art books and stuff like that. I went through Paris, naked women everywhere, magazines of naked women. My mom's like, just look at the ground. I'm like, okay. Of course, I wasn't looking at the ground.
I love that you go to Paris and they're like, "Don't look around."
like it's a dangerous city, we'll say, for the soul. The Parisians are notoriously
I
sex.
get your point, and I think I agree with you on. My point is that I at least believe everything that we consider to be sinful and harmful, whatever, in some way, you
Mm.
can argue it, and there is a logical reason to do it. That's why I brought up John. Now, John, and even John, by the way, and he probably forgets this because things stick in my head that don't stick in other people's, but so I doubt he remembers he even said this. Even John admits himself that he didn't reason his way to God, right? Like, he stopped before he reasoned his way to God, and then he had a literal religious experience. The only person who I've ever seen at least claim they reasoned their way to God, though not to Christianity, at least initially, but like, is a philosopher, literally a trained analytic philosopher named Edward Phaser, who, started off as an atheist materialist and literally taught a class on Aquinas's five ways. And in teaching the class, realized that every objection he had was incorrect and the arguments actually worked. And this, like, blew his mind. Yeah. But like, I'll be honest, like, as much as I thoroughly and totally respect Thomas Aquinas, and I've even read, used, can give the five ways, if you had presented that to me, in a time of like when I was more lukewarm, like, would it really have helped me? Probably not, right? Like, I never lost the faith per se. Like, I never actually stopped believing in God. There was a period where, like, the new atheists were like in vogue, that I read a little bit of them, and they kind of frightened me. Which in retrospect was dumb because their arguments are awful. But I was in high school and I was an idiot, right? Uh, So like there, but that was one of the things where it's like, if you had at that time presented to me and said, well, what about Thomas Aquinas's arguments, I would have read them and I would have like tried to grasp them. I wouldn't have, what actually helped me was Ed Fazer, in fact, but he was not just presenting arguments and going, that's it. He was specifically responding to the new atheists and going like, this is the reason that this point, and this point is incorrect, which was something that at the time that was very helpful for me. But yeah, all of this is to say that as we've gone around the block a little bit, right? All of this is to say that the point about Alcoholics Anonymous is that while you can make these logical arguments for like, alcoholism hurts you, and this is one that's not even controversial, right? Like there is literally nobody on planet Earth who's out there going like, well, actually, if if you drink 5 beers a day, your health will, I'm making up a number, but like, right, your health increases, like, but just knowing that it's wrong isn't enough, right? Like that's not going to do it, you know. And
And they
even like,
realized you couldn't reason with the alcoholic, someone who's truly an alcoholic. Now, someone who maybe has a drinking problem for a little bit, like okay, here's a great example, right? If you're in a car and you get pulled over and you're drunk, okay, let's say one guy just had a little bit too much to drink that night. Okay, he goes to jail for DWI. The other guy's a full blown alcoholic. He had too much to drink that night. He goes to jail for DWI. The first guy who just had, had a little bit too much to drink, it wasn't like he was an alcoholic. He's going to come out of jail and he's never going to drink and drive again. He's going to say, man, I messed up. I was so stupid. Like I learned my lesson. And that's enough for him to and he might even come out and say like, I'm just not going to drink at all ever. Or or at the very least, he will always remember that consequence. How much, oh gosh, I lost my job over it. I had to pay these fines. I had to sit in jail. Like, and it's enough to like shake him and get him because he's not truly an alcoholic. The true alcoholic is going to get out of jail and be like, man, that sucked. All right, where's the closest bar? And that's what they realized in the early 1900s was they were like, man, like nothing is stopping these guys. Like nothing, no consequences, no nothing. And then when by the time I come into alcoholism, the big thing was like, oh well, if you could just figure out what your triggers were, like, oh, if you could just figure out like what makes you drink or what your trauma was, like when did all this start? If you could, if we could just address that, it was more of like the psycho like analysis of it. So that's kind of where the emphasis was put. I think now in more the modern age is if I could just understand why I do what I do, then I won't do it. And that wasn't true. Like even after I had done therapy, even after I understood what some of my triggers were or what some of my trauma was, I would still be like, okay, yeah, like I get why I'm drinking. I'm still going to drink. I'm still going to drink until I can't drink anymore. Like there was nothing, it wasn't the big book, again, written 100 years ago, says this. It says that self knowledge won't actually get you anywhere. Like knowing why you do what you do is not enough to save you. Again, there was this emphasis that like it has to be a spiritual experience. And they don't use the word religious, they do use the word spiritual. And so for some, it looks very different than others. Some really do have that one instance of like a profound moment, and some it is more of like a gradual thing of relapsing a couple times and then having that experience. But that's what it takes, because you can't the logic, the reason, to try and understand. And that's why I think addiction is so frustrating to the loved ones around the addict, because they're
yeah,
like, why don't you just stop? Like you're hurting the family, you've stolen from people, your wife left you, your kids hate you, like you've gone to jail, you've lost your jobs, the bank account is empty. Like the family is seeing the damage and the devastation. And to the family, it's so simple. Just stop. Just stop. Don't do it. Like clearly it's not working out for you. But when you are truly an addict or an alcoholic or are in the midst of an addiction, same thing for pornography. And that is, I think, the predominant addiction of our day. And I think the numbers are way higher than anyone realizes, for both men and women. But when you're truly addicted to porn and someone says, oh well, just don't watch it, like it doesn't even make sense. Like if don't you think that if I could have done that, I would have by now? Like don't you think I've tried just not watching porn, just not drinking alcohol? And when you're in the throes of addiction, you can't save yourself, and that's where that spiritual experience has to happen for people, because the consequences don't mean anything, and you can't pull yourself out of it. It really takes like an act of God. It takes that, what we call is surrender. It takes letting go and finally realizing, okay, I might not know who or what God is, but it's not me, and I'm not going to be able to save myself, and so I have to surrender. So that's a big part of it.
Yeah. It strikes me too, like, Ben, the other thing too is you mentioned, like, even these people with experiences. We mentioned Paul earlier. Paul is probably the most famous conversion experience ever, right? Like, literally sees Christ, goes blind, gets healed miraculously, all of this stuff, right? And then becomes the greatest Christian missionary of all time. Okay, all of that's great, but then in one of his letters, he writes about, the why do I do what I right like why do I do what I know I shouldn't do. So, like, you can ask Ben, your dad, right, was an alcoholic, and then his alcoholic was gone. It's like, sure, obviously your dad never sinned again, right, Ben? Like, that was it. That was the end.
I wish that would have been great, but no, like even for this stuff, it's like, well, what's the punishment for this or that? Well, what if somebody walks in on you, mid, porn session or something? It's like, okay, that's minor embarrassment that, your dad or your mom or whatever walk in on you. Well, guess what? They are really not wanting to think about that. They do not want to think about it. They do not want to interact with it. They do not want to, even really punish you for it. And I want to be clear, I'm not going to describe what exactly, was going on in my family. But, there's even a sort of element of enabling for it, not because of some sort of, evil on the part of the family. But, I mean, it is evil in its own way, but also because it's like, well, what are you going to do with it? In the situations that we had to deal with. It's for a lot of people, the idea that you can confront that in your own child is something that's, I think, a lot more difficult than people will want to ever think about or even talk about. With my dad, he was saved from alcoholic. He has not had a drop of alcohol his entire life, knowingly. As far as I know, and I don't think he's the right type of autistic to follow through with it in ways that other people don't. It is what God gave him to succeed spiritually in the task that God needed him to do. And that's kind of weird to say, but no, it's exactly what is needed to happen. And with porn, it's like, okay, so ignoring embarrassment. I'm in an apartment all my own. The curtain is drawn. There's nobody hiding in my. I'm hoping there's nobody hiding in my closet. What stops me? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Well, the angels in heaven can see you. God can see you. Okay. The spiritual change that we're describing has to happen. That has to matter. The outside forces compelling you to be moral have to be inside forces compelling you to be moral. It's like, it doesn't, like, people want some sort of magic bullet, but there's no magic bullet to living morally. The only thing that they have to do is to live moral. Like, you have to make those choices. I'm dealing with my weight. I'm eating too much. I've eaten too much my entire life. It was my comfort thing, and I'm a really good cook too. So I'm not eating slop. I'm eating great stuff. Well seasoned, succulent. People come to me and they praise me for my ability to cook. So with that, it's hard to say it. But what I've been doing, I don't have any. I've got some over there. Is if I want a pizza or something like that, I'll do the order, which satisfies it. But before I hit send, I eat a rice cracker. I like rice crackers, and that kills cravings. I have no idea what the equivalent is for pornography, because if you look at it even a little bit, it will get stuck in your head and start drives that you can't really stop without a cold shower. But you you but there are ways in this world, but most especially in the spiritual nature of the world, that you can do to sort of break yourself of it. Uh, you know, but the thing is with alcoholism, with any addiction, it's like it's got to come from the higher power.
Mm.
I'm trying to think of how I want to say it, because it's hard to go over it, because it's like the gluttony thing I had to work on quite a bit for quite some time before I was able to start actively fighting my weight down. I could fast, and it's easy to fast, once you get into that mindset, and once you get over the hump of hunger, your body goes, oh, I'm not getting fed. I better, conserve. But it's like it's harder to, have a rigorous exercise routine. It's harder to have a plotted out diet. It's harder to, be disciplined in your life, you know. And I think there's a connection throughout all these, especially when it comes to sins of the appetite, which things like sexuality, um, I mean all kinds, not just like say the porn addiction, but disordered types like homosexuality, lesbianism, transgenderism, furries, um, insert an umbrella of things, uh, recursive bisexuality, I guess. I don't know. These things are all sins of an appetite of sorts, or of something akin to suicide. Take your pick for some of these things. It's you have this appetite for a sin, and then it overcomes you, even though your higher nature may say, "Hey, don't pick up that bottle. Don't click on that website." I was doing a little research on you, Breanne, just to see if you had a Twitter account or something, and all of a sudden I scroll down, okay, article about her, and then there's the Pints of Aquinas article, and then there was a horrid sex act. Not even, you know, some breasts or something, but like a horrible hardcore thing. And I searched your name, and they didn't have it. It was some sort of algorithm thing. And I want to
Mm.
be clear, it wasn't connected with you at all. So don't think
Okay.
that. I'm just
Thank
saying
gosh.
that like I just did a search, and Brienne something something porn star this, I wasn't looking for it. I certainly wasn't expecting it. Uh, you know, and I clicked off, but it was like, it's that pervasive. Just like there's a McDonald's in every town, and every street corner in some places, certainly a Starbucks for those sugary drinks. There is an image about three, four posts from the top, just out of sight, so you scroll into it. But yeah,
Yeah, you're hitting on, I think, a point. I correspond with a lot of people via email, a lot of people in recovery, or people who are in the throes of addiction. And an interesting point that you're making is, I've struggled with several addictions, and certainly while alcohol and drugs are very hard to turn away from, I don't need them. I don't have to learn how to moderately use cocaine, right? Like I don't need that to function. But with things like food and our sexuality, right? Those are things that we are God given in a way, like our hunger for food and our sexual drive, like those are things that can be good. I mean, they can also be very distorted, but we shouldn't just you can't just cold turkey, well, I'm just not going to be a sexual being anymore since I'm in recovery for pornography. It's like, no, 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 like it's and so in a way those addictions are harder to overcome because it's not just about cutting it out completely, like with alcohol and drugs. Now you have to learn how to do things in moderation, or how to
Yeah.
do it properly ordered. So obviously for me there is no moderating pornography. I've never been able to do that in my life. I will always go crazy with it, and it's always destructive. But I can't just like not be sexual. I mean, like now I have to figure out, like, okay, well, what is normal sexuality? What is a healthy sexuality even look like? Like, how does God want me? like to use that. And so in that way, I find that those addictions are particularly difficult to overcome. There's a lot more trial and error, a lot more failure, a lot more, slip ups, relapses, that sort of thing in those addictions. And I think people don't, I think because sometimes people have heard the stories of the alcoholics and the drug addicts who like were done with it, they put the bottle down and they never touched it again. Like I think that's the idea of like, oh, well, that's how you get over an addiction. That's how that works. But particularly with food and any of the sexual addictions, it's not like that. It's a lot more nuanced. It's a lot more complex. It's a lot more. Um, I don't want to say difficult because again, that's like a comparison thing, but there's a definite challenge there. Again, to your point that like, okay, there's a McDonald's on every corner, right? So if you're trying to like, if you're overcoming a sugar addiction, like that's hard. There's not necessarily a cocaine dealer on every corner, I guess, unless you live in that part of town, I guess. But like for the most part, and the other thing I think that makes those addictions harder to overcome is as hard as it is to admit like I'm an alcoholic or I'm in recovery from drugs or whatever, like people get behind that and they kind of support. They're like, oh, good for you for getting sober. Like, oh, like my uncle just got sober too. And like there's this understanding of those addictions because they
Yeah.
have been so visible and around for so long that people like want to support it. But you're not gonna be like, oh, like I binge and purge 5 times a day, or oh, like I'm a sugar addict and I just ate an entire package of Oreos and a pint of ice cream like in one sitting. Like like, but I'm trying to overcome it. Like people like freak out and they're like, well, like I don't know. And certainly with pornography addiction or any sort of sex addiction, you just don't have that kind of support and that openness and that understanding. So it feels
Yeah.
like you're in it alone.
Pornography is one of the strangest too because it is so pervasive that I would say like if you know or are an alcoholic, there even now, like even with the publicity of it, like it's I want to say it's still like somewhat unusual in a
Mhm.
sense. Like just there you go, like, oh wow, like if you meet someone, you might go, wow, right? Like, and then you might even be impressed if you've seen like, oh, you've like you were saying. Whereas if you meet a pornography addict, I would say probably you've met many over the course of your day without realizing it.
Mhm.
And yet you would never know it because they will never ever talk about it. Like, and I don't even like, I think there's a point where this is even appropriate in a sense, right? Like
Mhm. Right.
at
There's a
least to a
level of
certain,
prudence to it. Yeah.
yeah, because it's like, I certainly wouldn't be telling people it's like, yeah, man, I'm a porn addict. Like, shake someone's hand.
Right.
And then they go like, really? Me too. Best friends. And you fist bump and now you go off and you go, great, got a covenant eyes, buddy, right? Like,
Well,
but
it's like
yeah,
even describing, the issue, with pornography is dangerous because guess what? To describe, the horrific sex act I saw just scrolling through Twitter, looking up a Christian, like it would be to arouse the passions, to put it clinically. Like where if I say, if I'm to talk to an alcoholic, I say, oh, I had a glass of whiskey last night. He might think, I could use some whiskey, but then he'll go like, no, not really. It was a bit of a jerk thing to mention it, but at the same time, if I'm just saying it to some random person, it's not the same thing. But with that stuff, it's more primal than language itself. It's not that I want to be some sort of weirdo, psychosomatic, whatever, but there's, the danger is in its existence outside of God's
yeah,
boundaries, not some sort of physical thing that you can say, like when I have Christians over to my house, I say, I sort of I drink alcohol, I don't drink it every day. I can pick it up, put it down. The alcoholic gene isn't in me. The same way as my dad, gene, quote unquote. Excuse me. I say, what sort of hospitality do you need? And I imply, I've got some sugary mixer drinks as well, so I can make, like, I've got something called squash, which makes a juice. Uh, you know, and they usually tell me, oh, I'll just have some water, or I'll have some juice, or I'll have some milk, and it's all good. No one needs to be awkward. and if it offends them that I have alcohol, I do not offer it. There's ways to be polite, but if I say, something like, you know, if I have a giant, naked woman on my wall or something, Pamela Anderson in lights or something like that, there's no polite conversation. you know, there's no way to say, oh, if you do not drink alcohol, I will set the gin aside. You don't have to look at it. You don't have to have any of it. I will politely ignore it. I'm not going to have a drink if you're not going to have a drink. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, I've painted Aphrodite in all her glory on a 10-foot section of my wall. You can't avoid that.
Yeah, and there is a point too, though. Like, there is somewhat of a parallel in like things that are triggering for certain people and not others. For example, like me and Ben and I should say, since we're writers, so we use correct grammar. Uh, Ben and I are both fans of like anime and manga, which has a reputation for having a lot of terrible stuff. Now, I do not recommend like I actively tell people like to what to avoid, right? Like I don't play with that stuff. I don't even really make jokes about it because I don't find it funny, right? It's like no, you avoid this. It's filth, right? Like this is the most popular anime this season. It has 5 graphic sex scenes, and I tell people like avoid that. It's filth. Like I don't even play. But there is a sort of gray area in that there are things that like aren't objectively pornography, but will sometimes, and this is in Western media too. It's just my mind went to anime with it, right? Uh, yeah, like there are certain things where you go like, okay, but they wear skimpier clothing in this. Well, me personally, my constitution, I could say like, well, I started watching anime when I was like, late teens to early 20s. I did not grow up with it. It didn't warp anything that I like to view. I could watch it and it pretty much like it's not going to bother me at all.
Mhm.
Right? It's like that doesn't mean that I would ever like you shouldn't anything that's going to be drawn any sort of photorealistic way is still going to be pornography, right? But at the same time, where it's like, okay, there's a certain show where they have like women in relatively skimpier clothing. There are people who I would say, if this sort of thing bothers you, avoid it, right? Like, you really shouldn't watch it. But there are other people where I go, like, this show is actually very good. It has a lot of things going for it. I don't consider it pornographic because they don't show anything sexual. They don't show any actual nudity, right? They're just where, some of the characters at certain times. And this is in Western media as well, right? Like, but there are also people where you go, like, yeah, but I struggle with this thing. It's like, then don't watch it. It's not worth it.
Yeah. And
Like,
that's what I mean
it's
by like
never going
there's
to
a
be
lot
good.
more trial and error involved when you're recovering, especially from pornography addiction, where you're trying to figure that out because you don't know. You don't know if you can sit down and watch a movie that has certain scenes in it, and you don't know yet like if you can handle even things like going to the beach. I mean, the way that people are dressed these days, and some people can
Yeah.
and some people can't. And so I think that's where what I say, like, you need this extra level of grace because, again, unlike the alcohol and the drugs that are everywhere but also not everywhere, like the sex stuff really is everywhere. And I mean, even when you're just searching someone's name innocently, like it's going to pop
Mhm.
up and be in your face. And so there's, I think, a added level of grace or just like patience that you need to have with yourself if you're trying to overcome these sorts of addictions in particular, of like, no, this is what I need, or this is what I don't need, this is what's good for me, this is what's not. And defining those things, because it's not as black and white as drugs and alcohol. And same with food. I mean, I know plenty of people in recovery for eating disorders, or some people like could reintroduce things like sugar back into their diet, and others that couldn't, and they just can't have it. And again, it's like they had to figure that out oftentimes the hard way, and through that process, but eventually you do figure it out. And then knowing that, and then life can sometimes change too. What maybe was working for you once upon a time, suddenly maybe you got a new job, and maybe like you're up later now, and so now you
Yeah.
really need that filter on your computer, whereas before you didn't. And to just be flexible with that and to go with that and say like, okay, like yes, there was a time when I could avoid pornography in this way, but that's not working anymore. So now I got to try something else, and I got to learn and have to be patient as I go through this process, and to be, yeah, to be flexible and humble enough to say, like, okay, what was working is now no longer working. So
Mhm.
now I have to change things. Now I have to figure out what else is going on or what else I can do.
And you're right too. Like it can end up being so specific. Like where, for example, like I said, I could watch anime and like if characters in the to me, it's like I'm looking at a drawing. It literally will not register in my mind as anything. So like it's not going to right like not that again like there's a difference if it's drawn intentionally as pornography. Obviously, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like you see a character in a bikini and you go like, well, yeah, but it's a drawing, right? But
Mhm.
some people grew up with it, and this is like warped, and they can't do that. But the flip side of this is there was a movie. I remember having a conversation on the Superversive forum about it. It is a good movie. Like it's even a movie I would recommend to people because it doesn't actually show anything wrong. It makes interesting. This is Split by M. Night Shyamalan, right? If you've ever seen it. So this is like a movie about girls get kidnapped by a person who has multiple personality disorder, and one of them is an axe murderer. Like that's the summary of the movie. Yeah, right. Well, there are moments in the film that I'm like, this film is made where the best way I could describe was I told people like I was extremely uncomfortable watching it. Now, part of this is the intent of the movie, right? And I would say he didn't do it in a pornographic way. He's like, he tells the girls to strip at one point. So like, but it's not pornographic. They don't linger on them. The guy is a monster. He's evil. Who's right? Like, all of this is going on. There are people who I would go like, if this does not bother you, right? Like, it's a good movie. Maybe it's your sort of thing. Like, I wouldn't say nobody should ever watch this movie, right? But me watching it, it was like there were points in the movie where it's like I actually really don't want to watch more of this because like it's not that it's graphic or visceral or harm, but it's just making me very uncomfortable seeing like what's going on. So you're right. This is all to say that you're absolutely correct. That's different things with different people, and you need to be aware. And it's also true, like working, if you work in the school system, it's a certain thing with me where it's like, teacher student romance things. I work in schools, and it's like, I will not even make jokes. I will not like reference. I will never ever do anything like if it's sexual with students. It's like no, never, never, ever, ever. That isn't like 18-year-olds, high school. No, it doesn't matter. Because especially with men, it's like we're very visual. You can't put your mind even theoretically in that space, right? Like if somebody asks me, it's like, what do you think of it? It's like, don't even talk to me about it. I'm not answering that question. Right. Like, don't even bring it up. It is not my concern. Like you need to be in this place where you're like, I am not going to put my mind in a space where I could be thinking of things in that way. You know, but different people can handle different things. Like it's just how it goes. It's it's very difficult, right? Uh, yeah, it's a difficult thing to handle, I would say. So let me ask before we go, we'll get to like we've skipped large
Hold
parts
on.
of it, but it's a different type of interview. Oh,
Breanne,
go
do
ahead,
you
Ben.
have a comment on what either I or Anthony or whatever just said, or would you like to move on?
Oh, you're asking me if I want to comment on?
Yeah, just if you had a final word on the subject before Anthony
No,
moves us
no.
on.
Ben's a
I
good
mean,
host.
I felt like we hit on a lot of that, and just like the again, me just wanting to say like you've got to be willing to try different things, and to, to, especially if you find yourself struggling with these things that we talked about, because we hit on like a good amount of it, and so yeah, so to have that flexibility and stuff, but no, I think I touched on. Obviously, we didn't get through all of my story and stuff, but that's fine because I felt like where the conversation went, I think was really good.
Yeah, so that's why I was. This was a different type of interview, right? We were kind of going into like, what addiction meant and the comparisons with sin and things like that, which I
That's
think is
great.
good. The one thing that I want to end with, like, so where you're at now. So I mentioned earlier in passing, because it was mentioned at the end of the pints. You are 8 years sober, correct?
Yes. So 8 years sober with alcohol, and the eating disorder, I think I've got about 4 years. I'm going on 4 years now with that, so that's been another huge milestone. I guess drugs and alcohol is the 8 years, and eating disorder is 4 years. And then with pornography, I mean, that's something that like I feel like I get maybe like a year at a time under my belt, and then there's
Yeah.
some sort of slip up or whatever. But so that one, it's like I've had huge chunks of time, and that one's always come and go. But I do want to mention that, because again, people need
Right.
to hear that. People, because they'll hear the number like, oh, she's gone 8 years without alcohol, and they'll just assume that that's the same for pornography. No, it's not. Unfortunately, like it's much harder. And so, at least for me personally, it's been much harder. And so, I do want to mention that.
Yeah, so that's wonderful. And you mentioned on Matt Show you met your husband while you were doing ministry at college, correct?
Yeah, yeah. So I was doing it out of college. I was not in college. I've gone to college twice and I've dropped out both times, so still no
Hmm.
degree. But but I met him, and it was one of those things that, like, right away I could tell the Lord was doing something with that relationship. And I like, people always say, like, you just know, and like I felt like I just knew. And I was terrified though, because my husband is, I'm very devout, I'm very Catholic, I'm very religious, not just like spiritual but religious,
Right.
and I love the Lord, and ministry is like always my primary focus. And then I like meet this guy who's like an atheist, and I'm just like, just
I
completely.
do want to. I want to mention this. I feel somewhat obligated because I made a comment under. I don't know if you've read the comments.
Hmm.
Maybe don't, but maybe don't. It's never smart. But I made a comment, and it was like I meant it at the time. Like I was literally asking. I would go like, I'm curious. Like you said, I think I asked under the video. Like you said, you married an atheist, but like, how'd you justify? Then somebody commented under me, and it's like that's very and they said something like, that's a rude question. You shouldn't. And I'm like, no, I'm like, that was not meant to
That's
be
what,
rude. I'm
yeah, that's an
literally,
honest question.
yeah. I'm like, that was an entirely honest question, and it's like, I sent you I also, I felt okay about it. 'Cause I also sent you a very nice, glowing email,
Yeah.
like soon after the
No, it's a
interview.
legit question, and I think
Yeah,
I think what we have to keep in mind sometimes is, at least for me, because I was surrounded by very, very Catholic circles, I only had one idea of like what an atheist was. And that was like the angry online, like there is no God, like in your face, like just like super scientific, and just like, not that that's a bad thing. I'm just saying, like, that there is,
yeah,
it has to be empirically proved, otherwise I'm not going to buy into it. And just like the angry kind of atheists, the ones that hate not just God, but hate the church, hate Christians, and in my mind, like, okay, well, that's, if you're an atheist, that's who you are. And then I met my husband, and when we started dating, right away, I took it to prayer right away, like, Lord, like, what, like, I can't see myself marrying an atheist, like, that's crazy. And and a couple of things came up. Okay, so one was, I quickly realized that there are many different kinds of atheists. And this is me personally, I could never marry the type of atheist that I had in mind as an atheist, which is like hostile against the church, very bitter against Christians, um, just very bitter in general too. That would not work for me. That would not work for me. But when I met my husband and I started asking him right away, we were still dating. I put all these like big moral questions on the line. Like, okay, well, look, if we're dating, like, we won't be able to have sex till we're married. Like, and so, like, you've got to be okay with that. And he was okay with that. And then I was like, yeah, okay, but if we get married, like, we have to get married in the Catholic Church, and we have to raise our kids Catholic, and blah blah blah. Like, he was okay with that. And I'm like, okay, well, we won't ever be able to contracept, and we're gonna have, like, we're gonna have to be open to
mhm,
life. And he was okay with that. And so, like, all of these big, like, moral issues, these red flags that would have been deal breakers for me. Like, if he had said, like, no, you have to have an abortion, or no, you have to be on contraceptive, like, that would have been a deal breaker. But none of those things were there. And so he wasn't that kind of an atheist. And like, he was fine with all those things. And he even said to me, he said, I never want to be the reason to cause you to mortally sin. And he was very clear that like he wanted to support. He did not want me to compromise on anything that I believed, on any of my values. And so then I had to stop myself and say, okay, well then what's the objection? Because my objection to marrying atheists was, well, he's going to cause me to like fall into mortal sin or fall away from the church. Okay, well, he has agreed to go to mass with me every Sunday, and he has done that since we've been married. He's gone to mass with me every Sunday. Okay, so I'm not falling away from the faith, and I'm realizing that he's actually causing me to grow in my faith, because for the first time I was a cradle Catholic. Now, for the first time in my life, here's someone who doesn't know why we believe what we believe, and he's asking me, and so now I have to really know why I believe, and so I'm growing in my faith because I'm like, why do we believe that? And then I'm like looking up what a certain saint or whoever says, and I'm trying to explain to him certain theology and stuff. And so I found myself growing in my faith actually immensely, and even more so because I wanted to authentically witness to him in a way that, like, if he was Christian, I'd be like, oh well, he understands though. He knows that I'm a sinner. He knows that the Lord loves me both. But now I'm like even more so trying to witness to him, because like I might be the only witness he's got in his life, and I take it very like seriously. Like, I need to show him that, like, if I truly believe that this is true, then I have to show him that. I can't just like preach that. Like, I really have to live by it. So I quickly realized, like, okay, then if there's nothing morally wrong with marrying him, and if in fact he is causing me to grow in holiness, then what is the objection to marrying him? And I took it to prayer, and the Lord was just very clear of like, he just asked me like, okay, like, why do you want a Catholic husband? And I said, well, because it's gonna be easier, because like we'll be the same, on the same page, we'll be the same faith, we'll be, it's gonna be easier. And the Lord's like, sometimes like the easier path like is not the holier path. And I realized that I selfishly wanted to marry a Catholic, not even for the Lord's sake, not for my own sake of like, I want my life to be easier. I don't want a hard marriage. I want an easy marriage. And like, I shouldn't want that. I should want ultimately what God, but I should want a sanctuary.
It's true though. I'm going to be very, very vague because I did not get permission from someone to use this story. So someone that I know, I knew that she was dating for a little bit and got fairly serious with. She was a Catholic, and she was like a very intense Catholic, and she was dating a Protestant guy who she really liked, and they eventually broke up. And they broke up. My understanding of it was like she was just too intense, and it deeply bothered her that he was not convinced by her ironclad arguments for Catholicism. Like, surely you've been listening, right? Like, how can you possibly still be Protestant? And it was the sort of things like she was deeply disappointed about this. I'm not going to go into more detail like that, but like I talked to the guy myself at a different point, and that his basic thing was like, he was a serious Christian. I actually liked the guy. Like, he was a nice guy. I had an interesting conversation with him, but he made it clear, he's like, I'm not going to convert anytime soon, right? It's like, I don't really, it's like, yeah, I like this girl. I don't see how it could possibly work, because because it like upset her that he was not converting. So I've seen these sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think you have to have a healthy understanding that like ultimately like God is the one who converts hearts. Like, it's the Holy Spirit who convicts, like, not me. And so like I don't look at my husband and think like, why hasn't he been converted? Like, I don't think that for a second, because first of all, that is like the Lord, just as the Lord had a plan for my life and still does, right? And he had to break through to me in very specific ways that would only work for me and maybe not work for other people. And just as my life had to take a very specific, like, and my faith looks the way it does because of where it took me and that sort of thing. Like, I trust that God has that for everyone. And if I truly believe that, then it's not about me winning an argument or like somehow like winning him over, or like if I could just show him, make him read this book or have him listen to this podcast, like then he'll understand. It's like no, like my job is every day I ask the Lord, like, Lord, how are you calling me to love my husband today? Like, how are you calling me to love him and to show him that he is loved? and that's it. And whether or not it comes in my lifetime, there's a great I mentioned it in the podcast, and I forget the name of it all the time, but it's a woman who wrote a diary, okay, and she married an atheist, and during her lifetime, like, he never converted, and she died young, and but she prayed for him constantly, and she lived like such a beautiful marriage and a holy one. But after she died, he had his conversion, and he not only came to believe in God, but then he went on to become a priest, and she never saw that in her
Wow.
lifetime. And so I think it's selfish when I like, oh well, I'm only going to do this if I can see the fruit. Like, I'm only going to,
Yeah.
share the gospel with this person if they convert, because I want to see them convert, because then I'll feel better about myself, blah blah blah. It's like, so I think you have to check that at the door. If you have any of that going on, then yeah, like, a marriage is going to start to be very difficult for you, because you're going to feel like, and they're going to pick up on that too. Like, who wants to be with someone who's just like waiting for you to change all the time? It's like, no, I want you to love me for me. That actually needs to happen, and not just sit there and be like, well, I'll love you more if you do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, my line of thought here was thinking of the verse in, I forget the book exactly, Paul. he mentions being unequally yoked.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, okay, there must be a way to square this, but you are not the first, but the second, and I will read, we have a live chat from A.M. Freeman, who is an author who has also been a guest on the show in the past. Hi. Anyway.
Hello, even.
She mentions, yeah, the other person is John Wright, who we know, right? Like John C. Wright. His wife, so we're also friends with her. She's a lovely woman. She was a Christian when she married him, right? And it is very clear when you read the story that her prayers for him had a very direct and powerful effect on him in a way that is going to be unusual, right? Like, that if you expect this for everyone, you will be disappointed. Yeah, right? Like, because it was an unusual experience. So I dropped the cup that I've been drinking the whole time. It's empty at this point. Anyway, yeah, like, it was an unusual experience. But, so you are the second person I know who, right? The second woman I know who is a devout, right? Like, devout Christian, because so is John Wright's wife, right? Like, super serious, love the Lord, right? And married an atheist. So, when I think of unequally yoked, it makes me wonder, but I also think, on reflection, as I've thought it over, it's like, well, the church has always kind of admitted and been very clear, at least in the Catholic Church, it's always been more of a guideline than a rule, right? Like, and it's a good guideline. It's a good piece of advice.
Absolutely. I tell people all the time, I will never give advice that they should marry an atheist. Like, if you love the Lord, if you are heavily involved in ministry, if you're a Christian, Catholic, like, if you're devout in any way, like, my advice to you is not like, go out and marry an atheist. Like, that's never the default advice. But I'm also not going to tell someone not to marry an atheist, because I'm not God, and I don't know what God's will is for that person's life, and like, how conversion is going to come about for that atheist. And so it seems, yeah, like, if there truly was a big moral issue with it, that it would be like strictly forbidden by the church, and people are like, well, you have to get a dispensation. It's like, yeah, you do, because I don't think it's supposed to be the norm. I think it's more of like the exception, but that doesn't mean that, like, it's
Never.
yeah, like, never permitted or whatever. Like there are no exceptions to abortion within the church, right? Like, they don't give you a dispensation to go get an abortion, because it is always wrong, no matter what. But yeah, I think the norm is, like, you should try to find someone within the church. But if you suddenly find yourself not, and here's the other thing, just because you're marrying a Catholic or someone of your same denomination doesn't mean that they're a good Catholic, doesn't mean that they're, like, practicing their faith authentically. There are plenty of Catholics out there who are contracepting or whatever. So it's not even like, oh well, but he's Catholic, so I'm just gonna, like, in a way, like, I could, with my, the way that my husband is on board with all of the Catholic teaching, like, I could be living a more authentically Catholic marriage than some Catholics who are both Catholic, lukewarm Catholics or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that's also something to keep in mind too, is like,
It's true. Like,
they're a good person.
I once went to a young adult event where there was a young married guy there. This was like they were starting a new young adult group. It was their first meeting. And I am, like, I love theology. I'm very educated, right? Like, it's I enjoy study. Like, I find it, fun. Uh,
Ugh.
so I'm there. What was that, Ben?
Ugh.
Uh, So I'm at this meeting, and they're discussing, they mention like the church's position on contraception. Now, I am one of the very, very, very few people I actually know in real life who will actually care about the church's position on contraception, right? Like, most people they just don't. And that's that. Even relatively good Catholic, even good Christians, a lot of them don't even know about it. And if they did, they would go, well, that's just unreasonable, right? Like, I can't, Well, he asked it, this guy, and this is where, like, I understand that the situations get more complicated, because I could explain to him, it's like, so why? Well, it comes from, an encyclical by Pope Paul VI, Signum Vitae, and you go blah, 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 right? Like, go through all of that, and then he goes, I told my wife I was interested, and she threatened to divorce me. And you go, whoa, okay. I don't know what piece of advice I can or should be giving here. Probably none. I'm gonna shut up.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
what
Case
on
in point
earth?
right there.
And this is someone who is like, he's not fully he's trying to follow the church, right? He's like, I read about this, now I'm getting more into the church, and my wife's just not, and I don't really get it. He's going, right? Like, but I want to listen to what the church says, and I've really felt for this guy. I was praying for him afterwards. It's been, like over a year and a half, so I have unfortunately forgotten his name, or I'd say pray for him generically. Right, but anyway, like, I just remember being at this meeting being like, I could explain to you exactly why it is an objective sin, and therefore, you should never ever do it. And it's like, okay, but this person doesn't really understand it yet, isn't totally convinced. His wife, who is a Catholic, has also, like, she's getting pulled into this by the husband, who's trying to be a good husband, who has said, like, he was praising his wife. He's like, I am not, like, he goes, this is not me going out on a limb and going like, oh, my wife's crazy. Like, I love my wife. She's amazing, right? Like, he was not bashing his wife in this at all. Like, I want to be clear. He wasn't using this to complain, but he's just like, yeah, this is a thing where she was like, she thought it was like, maybe I had like OCD acting up or something, and I was getting crazy again, like from my own mental health issues. And it's like, and she said, like, if I insisted on this, she would divorce me. And I'm like, that was a moment where I was like, I am glad that in this moment I am not a clergyman, right?
Yeah, right.
Because I would not know what to say. And I didn't. I was just like, man, like, I will pray for you, because that is a hard thing, I know of one person, only of, he's like a YouTuber, he mentioned this, of one person who did in fact get a divorce because he was trying to follow Humanae Vitae and his wife wouldn't. And he eventually got the wedding annulled and got remarried, which, whatever you think of that, right? Like, so I know of one. So these things do have serious consequences, right? Like, but yeah, it's such a hard. You got to be very with these moral questions. It's like, it's so easy to say, like, what do you do in any abstract situation, right? And then you go like, okay, now you're in this real position, and it's like, this isn't one that I heard secondhand. This is one I was there and talked to the guy as he explained this, right? And it's like, I don't know what to say to that. It's like, that's so difficult. It's like, is it really,
That's why I think blanket statements or like blanket advice sometimes is so difficult for me to want to give, because every situation can be so much more complex. Even if someone takes time to explain their situation to me, I still, like, I'm not God. Like, I still don't understand the intricacies of it, or like the personalities that are at play, and like everyone, the even the life experience of the individuals involved, like, comes into factor. Like, there's so much, And so like it really is, you know, it comes down to like, again, seeking the Lord's will and asking what his will is, because ultimately, like, even the advice of others, or even comparing it to like, oh well, I heard that this worked for someone else, why isn't it working for me? Like, that comparison again, it's like, no, 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 our job is like, okay, Lord, no, how do you want me to do this? How do you want me to handle this? And obviously we can seek the counsel of spiritual advisors, or like, you know, spiritual
Yeah.
directors, and you know, the priest, and I think that that's all healthy and stuff, but really, like, discernment, I mean, just taking it to prayer and really allowing the Lord to direct you, and then following through with that, because a lot of times he might direct us down the more difficult path, and so to have the courage to follow through with that too.
Yeah, there's also I will say the one piece of like practical actually you can do now advice besides pray, which is always, you know, like literally always
Hmm.
good advice. And I mean that that sounds generic, but I actually don't really mean it generic. Like we've had someone on the show who wrote a book on decision making called Pray, Think, Act, Father Augustine Weta, where he's like that's the first step of any decision you make. So when I say pray, I mean in a very serious way. Like besides pray, what is another piece of practical advice you could do? I would say it is very helpful to have a good friend who you know and who you trust, who can give you more, who knows you well enough, and that. But it needs to be someone who's like, and I say this like Ben and I have had conversations of a similar ilk, and I've mentioned this before. Like Ben and I are close enough friends that Ben has called me out before for you are not reacting to this properly, right? Like uh, the specific situation that I am thinking of, Ben may or may not remember it because
I
I have
don't.
good freeze. Yeah. Yeah, there you go. The specific situation I am thinking of was that I had like a job offer that was in a few hours away, and I had another one that was closer but paid less, and I didn't want to tell my family about it, and I was like agonizing over this. And Ben, like, I was messaging Ben about it, just telling him like this is really bothering me, and I don't know what to do. And Ben like basically called me out and said, "You're hiding this from people. What are you doing? Like, why are you doing?" And then it was a genuinely helpful moment because I'm like, kind of slapped me away. He's like, he's absolutely right. Besides, this is a good problem to have. What am I even worried about? You know. And then I like said to Ben, it's like, I'll stop bothering you, but thank you. And I've had similar things with Ben, where Ben has like been, you know, I've seen him. I'm not going to say it because this is his life and not mine, so I don't have the freedom to reveal things. Uh, but he, you know, there are things that he did where I would like message him and be like, I don't think you should be doing that. You know, that I would not say necessarily to anyone, right? But Ben is a good friend who I have known for years, who works closely with me, right? And who I trust will take what I say in the right spirit, you know, and it's had an effect. So that is, I guess, the one piece of practical advice that I could
and
give is
and
that
that
trust your
we
friend.
see across the board. I mean, you see that, you know, when Christ sent them out, you know, and they went two by two, or like the fact that he had 12 apostles, like the community aspect, right, that we are called to, I think is vital, because it's in isolation that my self-centered thinking can really take over, my pride can take over, my ego, all those things can really thrive in isolation, but they kind of get squashed when you put yourself out there in community, in service, in friendship. Like
Yeah.
when you are now pulling yourself outside of yourself, okay, now you not only do you have ample opportunities to work on certain virtues, but on top of that, you have these kind of these mirrors that people can hold up and say, hey, like, I'm going to call you out on this thing you said, and they do it with love, and in friendship, you have that trust that's there. But that is also vital. And that, like, you see that too, like in AA, again, the other part of like carrying the message to the alcoholic who still suffers, working with a sponsor, going to meetings, like these are all things to get you to make friends, to be in community, to pull yourself outside of yourself. So it's in recovery, it's in the gospels, it's certainly good life advice, and it's one that I think today just does not, it just gets easier and easier to like never leave the house, the way that you can get food delivered and stay on the internet all day, and it's like we don't have to like put ourselves out there. But I think that that is vital for that healthy, holy life that we're seeking, is just that, it's the friendships, it's the being a part of a community and service and getting outside of ourselves. So I think it comes back to that too. So
I agree. The last thing I want to do is look at. We had a few more chats live on the live chat. We don't have a big live chat. We got 2 people, but that is 2 people. So, Caitlin did want to say this was, I believe she wrote this after you said it were after we mentioned you were 8 years sober. She said congrats. She's so proud. Keep it up. So,
Good.
nice encouragement.
Thank
Uh, and let's see this. The A.M. Freeman made the comment about marrying an atheist, and then she says later on, I don't understand when Catholics insist NFP isn't listed. I could speak on this because I've encountered this and I researched a little bit to see where the idea comes from. Okay, so basically, I have always analogized why is NFP acceptable and artificial contraception not? It's for the same reason that going on a diet is acceptable but purging is not, right? Like, it's the same type of thing. You can, and this is why they go using NFP with a contraceptive mentality is bad. This would be like starving yourself, right? Like, you can use NFP licitly. You cannot use artificial contraception licitly, right? And it's because in one way you're working with how the body actually works, and in the other way you are doing something to your body that is outside of it. So why do some people say NFP is not licit? Part of it is not understanding that distinction. The other is that in the church fathers, it's not like NFP isn't actually new, right? Like, and I know this because I researched it. NFP isn't actually new, right? Like, they didn't call it that, but this idea that there are certain times that women can get pregnant, others not, and you could track it with cycles and things, like, obviously, they weren't idiots. People know this, and they did this. So the church fathers wrote about it a bit. It was generally accepted among the church fathers who did write about it that NFP was a venial but not mortal sin. And that was the consensus of the early church fathers who wrote about it. Now, there is a problem with this, which is that we don't have a consensus of the church fathers because not all of the church fathers wrote about this. This is a pretty niche topic, right? So to say, like, well, I can't find any church fathers who wrote about it, it's like, well, yeah, because you find like 5 church fathers who wrote about it at all, right? So it's not a convincing argument to me personally to just point to the church fathers and go, well, that settles the matter.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it should. I don't think it does or should, because I don't think you get a real consensus that's like. I don't think enough have talked about it to even say that that's a real consensus. And also, to be frank, I think that the modern arguments in favor of NFP just are better, right? Like, I don't think the arguments against it work as well. Like, the fact is, you can't just say they said it. They had to have made an argument, and they did, and it was along the lines of like, well, you're still trying to prevent children. Well, right, but I don't think that that is inherently immoral, and I think that the modern arguments to that effect are just better. Yeah. So there you go, a mini history lesson. And then they mention that it helps with fertility issues and with endometriosis. Like, it's not just for fertility besides, which is absolutely and completely and devastatingly true. And kind of, I think, puts the nail in the coffin in it, too. It's like, no, it's like really, really, really helpful in certain situations. Okay, cool. And anything else that you want to add, Ben, first? Yes? No?
I when it comes to Catholic doctrine or whatever, I have opinions on it in the context of Protestant, but when it comes to biblical doctrine, the Protestant way is always to go to the Bible. Well, what does the Bible say? Well, the Bible says that the sins we do always have a negative effect on us, even if it's simply giving us an appetite for more degrading, horrible sin that makes you feel bad, even as the neurons fire in your head. And believe you me, feeling those neurons fire off in your head in sequence is fantastic. But it's something that's evil and from an evil and wicked source, where God intends it to be a holy, holistic, a properly ordered source. The statement is the animated trans pipeline is real. The porn to trans timeline pipeline is real. Yeah, and it's horrible, and it's quite frankly done on purpose. The interviews from the guy from some of the biggest porn moguls make it clear that a lot of them had beef with Christianity, and several of them had beef with Catholics in particular, especially since Catholics were the number one moral force in America for a long time as a single unit. Um, it's hard to sort of rally Protestants into anything when it's not a sort of war or something, you know, because it's like, what does that matter? It's an actress over in Hollywood. We don't even have a movie theater in 100 miles. Like, why do I care what the morals of a movie are? Well, it's Catholics in the cities. It's easier to have organizations like that. So it's something to take care of spiritually, and understand that you might never be punished with anything more than the knowledge and the horror of what you hunger for in your inner desire, and you know, looking for a punishment, looking for some sort of flogging, looking for, I couldn't even tell you, is not something that necessarily puts you more into the mindset of what God wants for your life. What God wants for you in your life is to pick yourself up and follow Him. Take up your cross and follow Him. The Bible is explicit about it. You're to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, body, but also love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. That's the whole law. So knowing this going forward, if you trip and fall, if you have a bad experience, you know, I'm probably going to struggle in about an hour. I got no one in here. Opening the blinds at night doesn't matter. No one's going to walk by. It's like, pray, keep your powder dry. Don't put yourself into temptation. Turn off Twitter. uh, make sure you're in a wholesome zone. Uh, get married. No, no, no. But yeah, no, and it's been a pleasure to have you on, Breanne. Anthony, I guess you're next.
Uh, sort of. Breanne, do you have anything that you want to add before I speak?
I think we've said a lot of really good things. I mean, it's hard to even think of things. I mean, I'm sure we could add things. I'm sure we could sit
Oh,
here and talk
always.
all night, right?
Right.
But do I have anything else that's jumping out at me? Not in particular. So thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate the
That's fair.
opportunity to speak and to be on your podcast. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, last thing I want to say, I told Ben I wanted to do this because I am very particular. I keep my personal life off air. I really keep it off social media, or at least have for years, right? Like, since, for the last few years, I barely use Facebook. I don't use Twitter, right? I don't talk about my personal life, meaning my job, my relationships, anything of the sort on air. The one exception, which I always mention on like my personal author blog, since I'm a writer, and is that I always said I would mention when I got engaged, and I got engaged yesterday. So my lovely fiance is Caitlin, who is in the chat. So I don't know if she is listening right now, but she was earlier in the stream. So I did want to mention that. That was the one personal detail I always said to people. It's like, if or when I either get engaged or become a priest, right? I will mention it. So that I did want to mention that. So, and happily, Caitlin is nice enough to at least pretend to listen to the show to drive up numbers. So, which is really all that matters. Uh, all right. Anything you want to say about next week, Ben, or are we just not sure yet?
Nope, we got things we want to talk about that are completely unrelated to this.
Caitlin
Breanne,
says I'm.
and April is freaking out in the chat. I knew she would. Uh, no, we're grateful to you, Breanne, for coming on here. We do have a lot of great stuff from you on that stuff. It's always good to hear about people, I guess, struggling with things, but at the same time, quite frankly, you've done more than what most people do, and hopefully this continues on, and we all reach that purification that people have argued over since Christianity began. Purgatory stream. I don't know anything about that, Anthony. Uh,
Yeah. See, we actually did have a purgatory stream, which is the joke. Uh, and although to be fair, Jen and I have known each other long enough that even on these streams we get along pretty well. But in another, there is an alternate world in another life where we're like at each other's throat.
where the Protestant and
Throats on
Catholic
stream.
wars are the only things that matter, where honorable Christian on Christian combat, where one can be guaranteed of the other's appearance in heaven after you blow their brains out. Yes, I certainly do not dream of endless holy war against other holy brethren. No, no. But no, thank you,
See,
Breanne.
of
Have a good
course.
night, everyone, and thank you for joining us next week. We'll do a bit of a variety show. I do want to talk about some stuff that have come up that's interested us all, and we'll just see where it takes us. Have a good night.
And we're